Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this August 17th, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and you can listen to my show every evening live from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's Pacific time on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Okay, on this Monday, my guest today is Deborah Andrasek. And if you don't know that name, let me explain who she is. This is her second time on this show this year. We've discussed her many, many times throughout the years and a number of parents that were involved in the Tony Alamo Christian Ministry. And today I have her back for a second time. We interviewed her about, I think it was about a month ago, and touched on a number of things regarding the raid that took place in 2008 and some of the ramifications of the church and basically the imprisonment of Tony Alamo. So I'm going to start out today and let Deborah just give us a little background first, Deborah, about how long you've been with the church, and start with that day it was raided, and maybe tell us a little bit about the history of the way that the authorities have come down on this ministry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
It's good to be here. And I have been with the Tony Alamo Ministries for over 45 years. And I actually came here when I was 18 years old, and I found Jesus as my Savior in 1970. And I've been with the ministry ever since. And what I'd like to start out with is there's some things that I haven't mentioned in the past. And one of them is that there were two specific raids that happened with the children. And one was on September 20th, 2008. And that's when they took the first 6 girls. And then 2 months later, in November of 2008, my husband and I and probably more than 30 witnesses from the Tony Alamo Ministries were in the courtroom in Texarkana at one of the custody hearings for the children. And what happened was Judge Joe Griffin had just given the order for the state police, for the law enforcement, whoever they were, to take all of the rest of the children that hadn't been taken, just to seize all the children from the Alamo Ministries. And then he dismissed everybody, and then he went to lunch, and it was around noon. And after he left the courtroom, we weren't allowed to leave the courtroom. There were officers with guns that were at the doors, and they would not allow us to leave the courtroom. And we were held there for at least 15 minutes against our will. And that was so they could give a head start to the authorities to go get our children. But we had been legally dismissed, and they held us against our will, which to me is false imprisonment. That's not known. There was eventually a gag order issued, and there were many things that weren't known about what was going on with our trial. And that's
how many children did they take from you?
From me, they took 2. They took my 16-year-old daughter, who didn't even live on the property out in Falk. She lived with me on Locust Street. She had her driver's permit. She was learning to drive, and she actually knew how to drive and just getting ready to get the final, the real driver's license besides her learner's permit. And then my son was taken in November 18th. And altogether they took over 36 children, something to that effect.
Right. Let me explain something so people understand this, and let me get your response, because what the state is claiming. Now, I've covered this story for years, and I really find that I believe you guys. I do not believe a word that's coming out of the mouth of those people in the courtrooms there and the people in the that raided your ministry. And what I wanted to mention was this: that the state is claiming first that your Christian ministry, who you've been a member for 45 years, is a cult, which in the minds of Americans who just read the newspapers and listen to CNN, You guys are bad guys. Okay. Now, they're claiming the reason they took these children is because they've been abused. One, by Tony Alamo, and two, by the parents who didn't take proper care of their children. Now, you've been there for 45 years. I've had testimony from so many people that show that this is a lie, and they're using this basically to shut down any type of Christian ministry like yours. So please respond to that and tell people really what this ministry is all about, and talk about these false charges that Tony abused these kids and you and the parents were not responsible.
Yes, this ministry is and always has been about winning souls and taking the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ to the four corners of the earth, following the Great Commission. And it's been this way ever since the ministry started in the 60s, and the ministry's gone all around the world. We've had different aspects of the ministry. Are feeding people every night after services in all of our different churches across the country. We always serve a free meal to anyone who comes and to the service, and we have given so much money to many, many people for medical, dental, eyeglass needs, even including taking care of water wells for people over in Africa and sending money over there to various people that have asked for money, sending clothing, taking care of people in many ways as far as physically and spiritually. And the main thing is, our main thrust is to get the gospel out all over the world, because that Jesus Christ we know is the answer to all the problems that in this world. And so what they did was, in order to get to Pastor Tony to get people to testify against him, they had a raid and they took 6 of our girls. That was in September of 2008. And my daughter that was 16 was one of the ones that were taken. And then again, they took more children on November 20th of 2008, and even more children after that. And the reason that they're doing this is because they wanted to disband the ministry. They wanted to break it up. They wanted to get some of these children to testify against the pastor. However, it was proven by people from UAMS that none of these children had ever been abused by their parents or by Pastor Alamo. No one had ever abused them. And I wanted to...
Well, how did they get these kids to lie? You've taught these kids for years, you said. And one thing I want to mention, you were never called as a defense witness, which is very strange. But anyway, tell us, how did they get them to lie then? There are like 6 of them that testified, 5 or 6 that testified against him. That's the first domino that they wanted to fall. But go ahead. Tell us what you think.
Just to go back to the year about 1996, the Church of Scientology sued the Cult Awareness Network, and they won a judgment of about $2 million against the Cult Awareness Network. So the Cult Awareness Network had to regroup, and they basically went bankrupt. So they came up with a new name after they regrouped, and now they're called Wellspring Retreat. And this is where some of the witnesses against Tony had an in-depth 2-week brainwashing before they actually testified against him. And this program, it cost $5,000 per person plus their airfare. And
apparently the state paid for this, right?
They paid for it. The government paid for everything. One of the witnesses, they paid $1,500 for her child care while she was there being brainwashed. So this is, you asked how they get them to lie. This is how they get them to lie. And so all the bill, and not just that, but all the bills that they had accumulated while they were gone were paid for by the government while they were being deprogrammed. So they were all trained to say the same thing. And so, when everybody says
let me just back up a second, then you pick up right here. But let me just say this, that before this occurred, before this monetary coercion occurred by the government, they had a court order to take your children. The children didn't go there voluntarily. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, I'm not sure what you wanted.
No, I'm just saying, just to let the people know that they had this they had this planned out where first they get a court order to take your children without proving there was abuse, and then they go into the second phase, and that is to take them to Wellspring, spend all this money to coerce them to get false testimony. Go ahead. I just wanted to lay it out, and you're just filling in the gaps here. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, the children that were taken, not the girls that testified against Tony, but these other children, they were taken to Wellspring. They were taken to different mental therapists, and that was after, of course, they were kidnapped. Some of them were taken, and they did get several of these children to bring a whole nother lawsuit, and that's in the process right now. These children that were kidnapped, who originally, and we even have videotapes of how they loved the church, they loved the pastor, they loved everything, and now they're saying completely opposite. So that one of them is my daughter, 16-year-old daughter. Of course, she's 22 or 23 right now, but that's what they did. Yeah, they did use the brainwashing techniques for those children too. But what I was saying about these other this other situation where you had mentioned that they never used me as a witness, that's true. And I did teach these girls. I taught all the girls that were witnesses except for one of them that's 31, was 31 at the time. But all these girls had begged actually to go and stay at the pastor's residence down there at the ministry. There was a school and mission down there, and they all wanted to go to the school. They wanted to be taught there, and they wanted to stay there. And they had plenty of fun things to do. I mean, they could watch movies, they could go outside, and many of them would go out and play kickball. I used to take them outside every day. And they would roller skate, they went swimming and sunbathing, and there was always birthday parties, there was always fun things, and they wanted to be there. And some of the girls that would, and every one of them had permission from their parents to be there. And some of them were real troublemakers, and if they caused trouble, they were sent back to their parents. But whenever that happened, they always begged to come back again. So these are these girls that were bringing these lies against the pastor, and they would say that they would be good, they wouldn't do these things anymore, whatever they were doing, and so they would get to come back. So I spent a lot of time with them. I could have refuted a lot of these accusations, but I was not ever called as a witness. And there was a particular situation where one of the girls, now I'm not talking about the other children that were kidnapped. I'm going back to the case where the 5 girls, 5 or 6 witnesses, where they had won like $500 million in a judgment. And this one girl on one of these counts that Pastor Alama was convicted on, it was regarding a bus trip that Tony took to LA with his wife Sharon. And one of these girls and my daughter, I had not my daughter that was 16 when she was taken, but another daughter that is still with the ministries and agrees with the pastor and has never brought these kind of horrible accusations. Anyway, she was there. She and this other girl had packed their bags the night before. Tony was going to go to Los Angeles. And going on a bus trip was always fun because you got to do really cool things, according to teenagers. They love it, And so on the way out, what happened first, let me say, they had pre-packed their bags the night before, and I said, are you going somewhere? You got your bags all packed. And they said there was a trip planned for LA and they wanted to go. They had pre-packed their bags hoping they could ask at the last minute and get to go. And they were all excited about it. They were all happy. They just needed the permission. And I thought, oh, brother, they're not going to get to go. Well, they did. The next morning, they had gotten permission, and they were getting ready to get on the bus. And I found out about it, and they were all happy. And they did go, and they stopped at the Alamo down in San Antonio. And then when they got to L.A., of course, they went to church services out there at our L.A. church, and they went, which is actually located in Canyon Country. And they went to the zoo, they went to the Queen Mary, they went to the Pacific Aquarium, and they just had a really great time. So this is one of the counts that our pastor was convicted on. And he was innocent, and he was innocent on all 10 counts, and the jury knew that. But the whole plan was to get him convicted. And I would just like to read something really
Go
quickly
ahead.
if I can. This is an article that is from December 13th, 2011. And it says FBI and Arkansas State Police lauded for Tony Alamo conviction. And it says the trial and law enforcement teams that investigated and prosecuted Bernie Hoffman, also known as Tony Alamo, was among the 163 members of the Department of Justice recognized by Attorney General Eric Holder and Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys Director Marshall Jarrett at the 28th Annual Directors Awards ceremony Friday in Washington, D.C. The attorneys, agents, and staff recognized were Assistant United States Attorneys Clay Fowlkes, Kyra Jenner, and Candace Taylor, and paralegal specialist Karen Gentry of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Arkansas, Susan Goldsmith, M. Randall Harris of the FBI, I might add, Carl Malloy, Tim Akins, Francis Castile, Kim Weems, Jeanette Miller, Sherry Funk, all of the FBI, and John Bishop of the Arkansas State Police. Christine LaRue and Jane Witten, formerly of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Arkansas, also were recognized at Friday's ceremony. And pretty much that sums up what it was all about. They were given their work to do, and they did it, and they got their praise and accolades for it. So they were told to bring down Tony, and that's what they did. And I also wanted to mention that my other daughter, Alice, who is 27 years old, she was there through this whole thing. And she never, she did testify, I think, at one of the trials. She testified on Tony's behalf. And she did a great job. But it didn't matter what we said. Anything we said was a lie. And everything the opposition said was the truth. And that's how it was treated. And they had a job to do. They were out there to convict Pastor Alamo, and that's what they did. And I guess that's what I had to say regarding that. I did have something else I wanted to say. There's a couple of things. Do you remember Avril Manhattan?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote many books exposing the Vatican, and at one point, and he knew Tony. Tony knew him, and he sent Tony a telegram after he had written The Pope's Secrets, and he congratulated him on it and said bravo, because he thought it was a terrific piece of literature. And I believe you've read much of that on your program.
Yeah, that's an article Tony wrote years ago regarding the Vatican. Yeah, I have, and he's right on so many subjects. Go ahead.
And then I know you know William Cooper, Bill Cooper,
Mm-hmm.
and he wrote the book Behold a Pale Horse. And in this book, he also referenced Tony from his literature, Tony's literature entitled The Fugitive Pope. Yeah. So I just thought that.
Well, let me say where I come from on this. See, when how I met Tony years ago, this was years prior to the raid. I had lived and worked in Rome as a journalist during the 80s and understood, well, when I went there I didn't know what they were about, but when I was there, I happened to be there when there was something called the Vatican bank scandal, which was huge problem that the Vatican had then, and it exposed them for their evil deeds with the mafia and bringing down banks and all these kind of things I could never believe. So I started researching it and finally came to the conclusion that a lot more work needs to be done to find out exactly how they are involved with our government. So when I came back to the States, I started looking for people who were talking in these terms, and I found Tony to be one of the most outspoken ministers. There's very few who want to really talk about the Vatican as the institution, as the Antichrist, and then also mention things about what they're doing in the secular world, in the political world. And so that's how I got to know Tony and found out that he was talking about these things in the 80s long before I understood what they were when I was over in Rome, and had interviewed and talked and had people like Alberto Rivera come and speak to you guys. So I knew when I found out that there was all this coercion and the raids and the way they've been trying to take Tony down hasn't just happened in 2008. They started a long time ago. I knew they were instigated by the Vatican. And the Vatican's goal, basically, is to create a one-world government and a one-world religion. And Jesus Christ has nothing to do with it. In fact, they use Jesus as a cover. So I knew he was going to be in hot water one way or the other, because I found out in my research, which is really important, that when you become a threat to them, basically when you're what I call a successful ministry, and I'm not saying success is geared upon, well, it is to their eyes, geared upon numbers, it's geared upon outreach. And when I looked at and saw how many people you guys were reaching, I knew they were going to finally come down on you guys hard, and they have. So let's not forget the Vatican in this story. And also, let's not forget that on the 23rd of September, the Pope is coming here to speak in glowing terms, invited by our Congress. And I believe this shows us, people that understand this, how deeply, how much trouble we're really in right now. You might have a couple comments about that.
That's true. I know that when the Pope, to me, he's the Antichrist. When he comes here and he speaks before our Congress, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I guess he's coming to flaunt what he already has, all the power he already wields. And you mentioned that the Pope needed a church and government, and that's interesting because Pastor Alamo wrote some literature entitled Satan Needed a Church and Government. And of course, there's much scripture reference in there to show it. You know, when I first got saved, I had no idea of what was going on. I didn't even realize I lived in a spiritual world. But the Bible is quite clear, and it really has all the answers to the world's problems as well as individual problems. And when Jesus saved me, the more I read the Bible, the more I became aware of what was going on in the world today. And sometimes when I go back and I listen to Pastor Tony's messages, I say to myself, well, there you go, right there. That's one reason why they've got him in prison, because he always would, he preaches the message of salvation, but we're living in the last days. And he would always bring it all around to, if you're exposing Satan, Satan's seat is in Rome, and it all goes back to the Vatican. And the Bible says that every person, everybody that was ever slain on the earth, it goes back, that blood is in the Vatican. And you can't possibly preach the gospel without bringing in what's happening in these last days. You have to tell the whole part of it, every bit of the gospel, and he does. And so yes, I know why they went after him, and it's pretty obvious. And then certainly with all the accolades these people got, and of course, John Bishop of the Arkansas State Police and Randall Harris retired not that long after they so-called brought Tony down. But it's not over yet, is the way that I look at it. And God started this work. He called it out of heaven. He spoke to our pastor, as you know, his testimony. And it's not over yet.
Listen, Deborah, let's take a break, and then we're going to come back for the second half hour on the Investigative Journal and talk more with Deborah Ondrasek regarding the Alamo Ministry. Basically, she's been a member for 45 years, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the state of the ministry this time. And we'll be back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Okay, we're back on the Investigative Journal for this final half hour, and a good one it is. I mean, I want you people to go back, really, your listeners, and check out my website at arcticbeacon.com, and you're going to find hours and hours, years and years of shows regarding this ministry and what happened. And the reason I chose this is because my area of discussion and expertise has always been in my personal experiences with the Vatican when I lived in Rome, and then connecting the dots and showing how Rome has controlled this country from the outset. And I'm talking about from the time of the Declaration of Independence, from the beginning of this country up until right now. And as we slide 200 and some years into the present right now, the reason that I wanted to pick out the Alamo ministry is to show you how the Vatican, with its minions in government, are silencing people who want to worship God in their own manner. Now, whether you're a Buddhist or whether you're an atheist or whether you're whatever your religious affiliation, take heart in this story, because if a Christian in this country, and we're called a Christian country, cannot worship God in his own manner and has to put up with all of these government harassments, you're not protected either, unless you do one thing. You bow down to that man that's going to come into this country with a dress on September 23rd and lay claim to the country that they believe they own. Those are the owners, and the workers for them are the government officials that are calling them into Congress. Now, Tony had talked about this a long time, and one of the things, and I'm trying to tie this together for Deborah because she's been with this ministry for 45 years and has given us a lot of personal testimony regarding this. But when you look at the big picture here, all she ever wanted to do, and these people ever wanted to do, is worship God, devote their life to God, do good things, bring and help people, create enough financial ability to do that. And because their ministry grew, it became a threat to this one world religion the Vatican wants to create. Now, you may not believe this if you don't read the Bible or you're not a Christian, but the Pope is going to disguise himself and this organization in Rome. They're going to disguise themselves behind the cloak of good and Jesus and God, when in fact they're just the opposite. And Tony had talked about this, and he was a minister that was not going to just, he was not going to leave out one stone in this story, and so it had to talk. He had to talk about the Vatican's control of our government. He had to get into areas that other ministers won't touch, and that's kind of where the Vatican draws a line in the sand. And their ability to infiltrate churches, bring churches down, is how they operate. And that's why I bring these people on, because I want you to understand that there is no freedom of speech in this country anymore. There is no freedom of religion unless you toe the Vatican and the government party line. And we're seeing that play out before us. Look at what's going on in this country right now. I'm sure Deborah feels that axe coming down on everybody's necks. A little bit about the state of America right now from your eyes, a general point of view, before we get back into some of these specifics.
Well, the way that I see the state of America is that it's a nation that is given to sin and given to drunkenness, drugs, given to, I just don't care. Just give me my TV, give me my cable, give me my iPhone, my internet, and I just don't really care what goes on with the rest of the world. And it seems like they just don't give a damn, and they've been brainwashed by the mass media, totally brainwashed. I mean, it's incredible the job that the mass media has done with these people just by them constantly watching and listening and taking in. You tell a lie long enough and eventually you believe it yourself. And that's what they do. They just constantly spew out their lies. Spew out lies about everything, about the Vatican, just whitewashing the Vatican and all the evil that's been done, all the babies that have been murdered, that have been sacrificed, all the people that have been murdered by the Vatican, trying to whitewash their image, make them look like they're Snow White, like they're just wonderful. They've changed now, they say. They haven't changed. They're the same. And Satan has just used that organization. They're deceivers. To me, the country, America, is just a deceived group of people as a whole. Their government leaders are as corrupt as they're the ones that should be in prison. A lot of these prisoners should be set free. And they're very evil people, as we know. And the information's out there. Many books have been written about it. And if you go by what it says in the Bible, and then here they've taken something that was ordained by God, which is a marriage between a man and a woman, and they've taken it and twisted it and perverted it. And don't you dare say anything about it, because that's the way it is. And you go to jail. You lose your business if you say you don't want to make a cake for these reprobates that are a man marrying a man or a woman marrying a woman. And that has become just militant. They are just like in your face with it, and you better do it or else.
Yeah, anytime they politicize something like that, make it a political issue, you've got to understand there's more to it. I'm going to refer everyone to some of my old shows regarding this topic of homosexuality. And you may want to go to a book called The Pink Swastika. And this is a guy named Kevin Abrams who comes on my show periodically to explain what's happening in this country and why these issues are being politicized. We'll leave it there, or we could spend the whole show. Let's get back to a couple little points here which may emphasize what happened to some of the parents, including yourself. And I want to read something off your website. It says, the judge, this was during the case, the criminal case, I believe, but may have been the civil. I don't know. But this is the paragraph I want to read and get your comments, because you knew these people. The judge who would not allow children to return home, even, and I'm going to add, and I've checked this out, there was no official abuse found on any of these kids. So what they had to do is to say this: because they're being homeschooled, and because some of the parents did not believe in vaccinations, they're abusing their children. This is a complete, utter violation of our constitutional rights. Now, this paragraph: the judge who would not allow children to return home, who terminated all parental rights, threw Sister Bethany and Brother Don into jail for 10 months because they would not turn in their other children. And much more evil died yesterday in that Little Rock hospital. Explain that paragraph to me.
Okay, well, the judge that did this, that was responsible for putting Don and Bethany in prison, was Judge Joe Griffin, and he died a few months back in the hospital in Little Rock. But what it was, he was only like 64, 65. Mm-hmm. I don't know. He wasn't very old. He had just retired, I think, this past December in 2014. But what happened was Don and Bethany had one of Don's sons was taken, and his other two children were away somewhere with their mother, and they were not taken in the raid. And Bethany, some of her children, her girls, and were able to get away in whatever vehicle got them away after the judge had made that order. And some of the kids did escape, obviously. Not all of them were taken. But 3 of her boys were taken. And because Don and Bethany didn't even know where their kids were, really, and at any rate, they were put in prison. And, well, actually, it was jail. And they were in jail for, it says 10 months. And that's a long period of time. And I would go and visit Bethany and Don, and they'd call and we'd speak with them. But they were there for that amount of time because they would not give the whereabouts of their children, which they didn't know anyway. But, of course, to them, everybody from the church is a liar, and they only tell the truth. And so they were in jail for that amount of time, and they didn't know where their children were, and they weren't taken, and they didn't want their children, quite frankly, to be taken. And look what's happened to the children that were. Many of them have turned against the church now because of the brainwashing they received.
Right. What's the status right now of all these kids that were taken?
Let's see. Some of the children have, well, I honestly can't think of any. No. There was a family of children that were returned. They had a son that had Down syndrome, and they were returned. But her family wasn't actually they weren't actually living on church property. They did get those back, and that was one of the rules, that we had to leave the church property. And
yeah, that's an interesting point. So explain this to people. What they were basically, I remember talking, to another, God, I'm going to have him on Wednesday, and his name escapes me right now. But let me just check it out. Go ahead. I want to check this name out. You were saying?
Okay, that, help me with this.
Okay, go ahead.
What were we saying? What was the last thing?
I know. I'm thinking of one thing, and you're thinking of another. We're talking about the children and how some of the examples of those that have not been returned and what they're doing right now. And I then wanted you to mention what the state was saying to these parents, giving them ultimatums in order to get their kids back.
Oh, yes. Well, what we were told was that we had to leave the ministries, cut all ties with the ministries, and move off the property, get a job. We had to hold a job for, they said, a minimum of 6 months in order to be able to get our children back. And you realize that, of course, after 6 months, your kids are not going to be the same.
It sounds to me like Russia or something. Hey, listen, we're telling you how to work. We're telling you what to worship, and if you don't do that, we're going to keep your kids.
That's right.
Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, when you really think about it, what have we become?
So a lot of these children that were taken, I don't really have any idea what they're up to now. Most of them aren't back here. They were adopted out. I know that they've all taken on the mindset of the world and forgot their Christian upbringing. And
yeah, I remember talking to one parent who actually had a conversation with the FBI, and the FBI basically said, "Listen, if you lie about Pastor Alamo, we'll give you your kids back." I mean, what the heck is that?
That was Bert.
Yeah, what's that? Yeah, Bert Krantz. Yeah, I mean, listen. I'll say this on my show. I'll say this to people. I've got people that email me a lot of time and say, "Well, why do you spend so much time on that ministry? They're a cult." And I said, "Well, did you really understand the story?" And I will mention something like that to what happened to Bert. And you know what responses have been? Well, that's just the way America is. And I'm going, what do you mean that's the way it is? Yeah, well, you can't fight City Hall. I said, but what happens if they did that to you? Oh, well, you see, I'm not a member of a cult. So basically what's happened is they have programmed people into accepting this. and in a sense have led most Americans into a lifestyle that they have no choice in living. They have really no. And I said, well, basically what that means is you don't have any freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And then they don't even care. So what I'm getting at, all of this kind of plays together. This story shows how we've been brainwashed, how people will not. If this would have happened, let's just say this happened 100 years ago. Do you realize the community that you lived in would have came to your rescue? The government would have been shagged out of town. But what happened in Fauquier, Arkansas? They all came to the government's rescue, didn't they?
That's right. Yes, they did.
That is the difference between America today and 100 years ago. And I did a thing, and I wanted you to know this. I remember right after the raid, I had a couple journalists. I said, "Hey, let's figure out what the people in Fauquier are saying." And I was reading the newspaper article, and then I called businesses at random, maybe 20 businesses in Fauquier. And I said, "Hey, I'm a journalist, and I heard about that Tony Alamo ministry. I don't know much about it. What about it?" And every one of them, there was not one person that didn't sound like that news media guy.
Yeah.
All they did is listen to they're dangerous. You can't get on their property. It's a cult.
Right. Greg, before and during the trial, there were always horrible articles in the newspaper, the Texarkana Gazette, and even in the Arkansas Democrat, which is owned by Gannett, who also owns USA Today and just hundreds of other newspapers and TV and radio outlets. So, yeah, and they were always saying we were a cult. And brainwashing, cult, and compounding, and you use the buzzwords, and they work. They work on people because people are used to responding to their master, the media, whatever it says they believe.
Right, and so I remember one person in a business, I can't remember what business, I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they go, "Well, they're reclusive. You can't get on their property. They keep you out. They're secretive." And I said, "Well, that's not what I heard. I heard you could just go up there and they might give you a free meal." And
every night at our churches all across the country, they're open, and
so it's not a secret organization. I mean, tell us what it's really. You can walk on there anytime.
Absolutely,
and that's probably what got him in trouble because they'd send infiltrators in there to try to stir up problems.
Sure. Oh yes, we've definitely had our infiltrators. I mean, you've had that. You've read those articles on your program about the ones that have we've known about that have infiltrated that were working for the FBI. And I just tell you something. This is kind of going on a different court case I've never really discussed with you.
Go ahead.
But it's regarding my son Spencer Undersack. Now here was another case where he and another boy had left the ministries, and they were used by the FBI, and there's no doubt about this, and I'm going to read something that proves it.
Go ahead.
But they were used to bring false charges against the ministry. They both received a spanking, and instead of just a lot of kids get spanked, and it's common. I mean, people know that. They get spanked to this day. But the government has mandated you can't spank your child. You can't do this. You can't do that. Don't do this. Don't do that. But make sure you brainwash them. Make sure you tell them that they might be a boy or they might be a girl. We're not sure what they are, but let them express themselves, so on and so forth. But what I want to do is read part of a transcript. This will be not long, but it's from the
we have about 7 minutes, so go ahead. 8 minutes.
Okay, it's from Spencer's and Seth's court case, which was June 2nd, 2011, and it says in the U.S. District Court, Western
now,
District.
What's their case? Tell us what the case is. What are they suing for? Money?
They were suing for money. Yes, okay. for millions of dollars.
Okay,
and the Texarkana Division, and it was Spencer Undersack and Seth Kalagna. It was a jury trial, and Barry Bryant, good old Judge Barry Bryant, who's always ruled against our ministry, just doing his job for the feds, he was the magistrate. He was the judge there. And they're questioning Randall Harris, and this is the question, taken right from the transcript. Did you have some understanding that Spencer Undersack would be leaving the ministry before he left? And the answer is yes. I was notified by a former member that Spencer, as well as another young man, had decided they were going to leave the Alamo compound in Falk, and arrangements were being made to carry that out. Question, was that before the raid? Answer, yes. This would have been, as I recall, in the spring, maybe early summer of 2008. Well, I'm adding in here, it was in May of 2008. And the reason that Spencer left, I'm adding this also, is because a girl that he wanted to marry had left the month before. He thought he was leaving to be able to hook up with her and get married to her. And he actually left with her brother, Nicholas. Okay, here's a question to Mr. Harris of the FBI. Did you take steps to be available when you understood Mr. Andrusak and this other young man were going to be leaving? Answer from Randall Harris. Yes, myself and the state police investigator I worked with, we were advised that particular night that Spencer and the other young man were going to be in a position on the edge of the property to be picked up. And so when we were advised of this, myself and the state police investigator, we went down to Falk to observe this, to ensure that no one attempted to interfere with Spencer's efforts to leave the compound.
Amazing.
Yes, they were right there to make sure that nobody interfered, because they already had a plan worked out with the people that were trying to get Spencer to leave to begin with, which was a relative of the girl who had left the month before. So the next question to Mr. Harris, did you go and try to talk with him at that point, with Spencer? And he said, the answer was no. We asked the person who was responsible for actually transporting them to inquire as to whether Spencer and the other young man would agree to speak to us, being the FBI agent Randall Harris. Question, did Spencer come running to you wanting to give a statement? Answer, actually, Spencer wound up living with one of his brothers, with whom I, Randall Harris, had been in contact with, and eventually I, Randall Harris, contacted his brother to find out if Spencer had ever gotten to a point where he would be willing to be interviewed. And then the question is, was Spencer somewhat reluctant at first to talk with you? And the answer from Randall says, oh, more than somewhat reluctant. When he first left, adamantly reluctant. So that shows right there that they were waiting. They were waiting right there on the property. Randall Harris of the FBI, unbeknownst to Spencer, that was leaving that morning at 6 a.m, that they were there waiting, just waiting to get a hold of him so they could question him and use him, because the girl who had left, Marissa, had told them that Spencer had received a spanking, and so they were going to expand on this and just make this great big case out of it. And the boys, with all the lies that were told and all the false testimony, the boys were given a judgment of $66 million, and on appeal it was reduced to $33 million for receiving a spanking. Now, what's amazing, and you've brought this out before, Greg, is how nothing ever happens like this to the Catholic cult, who has abused hundreds of thousands of children in this country and around the world together. I mean, it's probably in the millions, and if you add all the murders they've done, oh my God, it's unreal. And so, I mean, it's just...
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I brought up case after case after case. I can even remember talking to a police detective who found Cardinal Spellman, who was considered, this was during the Vietnam War period, Cardinal Spellman from New York, was sexually molesting children. He had evidence, categoric evidence, that this was going on, the highest cardinal in the country. And guess what? The police covered it up, and this guy ended up losing his job.
Yes.
That's what goes on.
I've seen that about him, yes.
Yeah.
And I was amazed and appalled at the absolute uncontrolled amount of sexual abuse of children and the murders that these people in the Vatican do. I mean, it's amazing, but I just have to go back and say, well, the Bible says it, in her is found the blood of all that were slain on the earth. And they will cover up, they will. And of course, Pastor Alamo, this ministry, we've been taking this gospel and telling it like it is about Rome, and for decades and decades, I mean, since the 60s. And
right.
So, of course, the persecution is going to come, and it has.
Well, listen, Deborah, we're all out of time. I want to thank you again for coming on. We'll have you on again. And we're all out of time. Listen, I want to keep in touch with me regarding what's going on at the ministry. And thank you again. That was Deborah Ondrasek. And good night on the Investigative Journal.